everybody, to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. And if this is your first time tuning in to this podcast, I welcome you and hope that today's episode is one that will allow you to come back for more content from our platform. And if you are a returning listener or viewer of this podcast, as always, I welcome you back and I hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and as always, insightful. So before we get into our main event, just a reminder for those who are tuning in from YouTube, please make sure you hit that red subscribe button so you can get future notifications on this podcast. Also, if you're tuning in from Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast, make sure you subscribe there as well. We also accept monetary donations for those who want to help us build this platform even further. You could do this through Cash App with our handle $IDTALK4ED, or you can go to Venmo with the handle @KwameSM. That's KWAMESM. And to catch past episodes of the podcast and future ones, you can go to our main website at identitytalk4educators.com, or you could just go to our main YouTube channel, which is under my name, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. And as always, thank you all for the support, and we're going to keep on rocking. All right, people. So we got another good episode tonight. We're going to be talking about a lot of different things. We're going to be talking about neurodivergence. We're going to be talking about inclusion in international schools, but also for those who are first generation African immigrants like I am, who grew up in the States or even abroad, away from the continent. We're going to talk about some of the identity challenges and things that we face when we are in that situation, when we have that kind of upbringing. And today's guest is somebody who can definitely provide some insight on what it's like to grow up in the States as a West African, but more specifically as a Senegalese-American, in my case, a Ghanaian American, and then to come back onto the continent as an adult and live a life where you have a family, you have children, and you're trying to assimilate as best as you can while navigating day-to-day life, while also balancing a professional career as an educator. So there's going to be a lot that we're going to touch on, but let's get right in. Without further ado, I'd like to bring on Maymouna Sakho to the podcast to talk about her life in Senegal, life as an international educator, and everything in between. So let's get started with this conversation. Hello.
Hey.
How are we?
I'm doing really wonderful, Kwame. Thank you so much for this invite. I'm excited to be talking to you and your audience. And just thanks.
Yeah, and like I told the audience, there's just so much that we can cover in this next 45 minutes to an hour, and we're going to definitely try to cover as much as possible. But before we get into the meat of what we're going to get into, I want to give you a chance to just share how everything all started, because this is Identity Talk. So we like doing these deep dives into how we become who we are. Well, in this case, we're still becoming who we
Right.
want to be, because as you know, when we talk about identity affirmation and just that process of understanding who we are, it's always a journey. It is a marathon. There are still things that we're still trying to figure out about
Right.
ourselves.
Yeah.
But anyway, tell me about your upbringing, because I know you from the boogie down.
Boogie
Yeah,
down.
boogie
Not on the
down.
6 train. I was on off the 4, off the 4 line.
And I know that played a huge role in your own upbringing.
Yeah.
So I'd love you just share a little bit about growing up in the Bronx.
Yeah. Yeah.
Please.
So my name is Maymouna. Maymouna means someone who is prosperous. I honor my grandmother by using that name. She lived to be 103 years old, and I was named after her. And I think the one thing that I always will speak from my adolescence and my growing up, I've always known that I was African, and I've always been proud to be African. I mean, there were circumstances that would dictate that I shouldn't feel that way. And we'll get into that in our conversation. But from the beginning until today, my mother made it very adamant that we were Senegalese within America. We were not American. So from the beginning. And so I was born in Harlem, raised in the Bronx. At the age of 3, my family moved back to Senegal, and I lived there until about 8 years old or something like that. Forgot all my English, everything that I had learned being in the US. And around that time, 8, 9, we moved back to the US. And so when I came back, that would have been elementary age. I think what stood out in terms of my very first experience within identity, within I think even neurodivergent and multilingualism at that age, was that I was a super bright girl. Coke bottle glasses that were this thick. I wear contacts now. Had the strings hanging down.
Yep.
So
Like Urkel style, like Urk. Mm-hmm.
And I was a highly intelligent mathematical student. Like that was my thing. But I didn't really speak the language, right? I didn't speak English. We had forgotten it. And they wanted to, because of my age and the fact that I didn't speak any English, they wanted to put me in a grade less than my age range. And my mom didn't have the capacity, didn't know the system, didn't have the language to advocate for something else. She kind of felt, I think, that she had to go along. And I say that story because I think it's a full circle moment, probably how come and why I became an educator. You know, like I just remember in many different points in my growing up in my educational career as a student, that my mom she didn't have the capacity to advocate for me or to know about the system, to, you know, speak to my teachers about the classes I was taking, and maybe I didn't realize at that age too that I could do that for myself, you know? So we'll get into that later. So growing up in the Boogie Down Bronx, my mom would plait my hair. I had my cornrows going down the back of my hair when I was small. I should show you my pictures when I was growing up. And as I said, we were very much tied to the identity of being African. I remember being called African booty scratcher in my middle school age by other Black students. I remember trying to fit in wearing the Air Jordans. I remember like just trying to move away, even though I knew I was African, but I kind of wanted to be like a little less African so that they can accept me, you know? And I was a dark-skinned girl. You know, in the Black African-American, African diaspora culture, there's this whole colorism thing, right? We all know about it. If you don't know, go Google it. I'm not going to educate you today, but it's a whole thing. And so growing up in that background culture, however you want to phrase it, it was hard. It was hard to navigate that. I was also always very independent. You know, I spoke up. If things didn't feel right, I would say something. And you add that to all the other stuff, you know? It's like, who's this kid? Like, why is this kid saying something? What? They don't have the right. They don't, you know, they shouldn't be saying anything. They shouldn't be speaking up. They shouldn't be, because of how they look, because of what their language is, because of how they present themselves, whatever it was. So that was I think my elementary, pretty much my elementary, most of my middle school academic life. And it was interesting because the neighborhood that we lived in, it was mostly West African and a few Dominican. I say Dominican in particular. There was definitely Latinx, but it was mostly Dominican in my neighborhood. And so some of my early friends were actually not African American or West African. It was actually Dominican. And I think I had one friend who was Black American. And I think from there, I was like, oh, but actually our cultures are actually not that much different. You know, my friend who was Dominican, in her household, she can only speak Spanish. I was only allowed to speak Wolof, even though we're growing up in America. And I'm like, we need to speak English. Why am I speaking Wolof? You know, my mother she knew something that I didn't know because here I am in Senegal. Yeah. And I connected to those friends because even though our on the surface, our cultures look different. In reality, it wasn't really that much different. We both came from families where we were first generation. Education was valuable within our culture and our families. And we were like the first girls, and we were the ones who were like pursuing mathematics and science and like in love with those topics. So it was all around an okay experience. I think once I made those friendships, but it was rough in the beginning, huh? It was rough trying to be accepted.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to a lot of that, but I want to definitely keep the focus on you. You mentioned something about your mother. And I want to
Mm-hmm.
touch on this because before talking to you right now, and I do this with every guest, I make sure I do my homework. I listen to all the different podcasts or different places where they're speaking about themselves. And you had mentioned a story about your mother's resistance to learning English. If I'm not mistaken, it wasn't until you were like in the middle of your adolescent years where she was like, all right, I'm gonna go ahead and start learning. But the fact that she was resistant to learning, I think when you look at it now as an adult, you realize how valuable that stance was from her because you're benefiting from it right now. I would love for you to just talk about that because as somebody who is very monolingual,
Mm.
came from a family where I wasn't taught my home language.
Mm-hmm.
My parents thought it was best for us to learn English as a way to navigate American society because of the times they came in.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm very, I commend your mom for taking that stance. But I just love for you to just share a little bit about that because I think that's important.
It's funny because I kind of always say that my mom is a bit of a revolutionary because my mother comes from a large family. It is stereotypical that Africans have a lot of kids, but in this case, it's fact. My mother came from a very large. I think my grandfather probably had 3 wives. He was a Muslim in polygamous relationships. And I think she probably had like 14 siblings, maybe 12. I don't know. But out of those siblings, my mother was the only one who left Senegal and like wanted to explore the world. And so
Mm.
even that in itself was kind of going against what was expected of her, number one. Then she left when she was like pretty young, right? So that's another thing. And she left with my father. And they had just gotten married and they left pretty early on. So when they came to the United States, they had lived in France, they lived in Martinique, and then they settled in the United States. I really think when she came, at the time that she came, it was, the movement for Pan-Africanism, and all these students were going abroad, to get the knowledge and skill sets, hopefully to go back, right? It started in the 60s, 70s, but definitely it was present in the 80s as well. And my mom was one of the few of Senegalese culture who came. And I think because of that, it was important for her, I would guesstimate, because we've talked about it actually, but I don't know that I've ever really asked her feelings around it. But I would guesstimate that she just really wanted to hold on to that culture because she didn't see anybody else who was Senegalese around her at that time. She was one of the first. And so seeing it was a large population. There's always been a larger populations of Ghanaians and Nigerians in general, Anglo-speaking of the African diaspora within the US. And she's coming from a French-speaking country. And so she's got that. She's got, Senegal is relatively small if you compare it to the other countries. So there's a lot of firsts and a lot of the onlys with her. And I think when she came into the US, I think she was just like, I'm going to hold on as much as I can. And I don't want my kids to be anything else than what they are. So I think for that, she didn't learn English until I was like 15. Maybe I'm pretty sure she probably knew some words and she definitely was playing me. But like she didn't really communicate until I was probably 15 or 16. And at that point, like, she was like, okay, I'm going to go back to school. I'm going to get my bachelor's degree. You got to learn English. You got to speak. You got to participate in class. You have to engage with your professor. And it wasn't until then that I think she wanted something that could be an example, I think, to my brother and I, that she was like, okay, maybe I should use the English that I have, But I remember going to parent-teacher conferences and I would have to translate everything to her, and somehow that's why I said I knew there was a little bit of English there because somehow I feel like she caught the things that I didn't really translate. So So for me, that was her way of like, in the midst of 100 million people of the same cultural background, relatively speaking, and she finds herself to be one of few, let me hold on to my culture and my language and my way of life for as long as my children can have it. Because once you become an adult, you make your own decisions, you know? And she didn't have to do that. She could have definitely said, no, I need them to speak English as your parents did, because I want them to assimilate. I want them to kind of get along as easy as they can. My mother was the complete opposite of that. She's like, you're going to get along as well as you can, but you're also going to know where you're from.
And for the record, this is not me casting aspersions on my parents, because I appreciate everything that they did. And they still made it clear to us that we're Ghanaian first, living in America. Yeah. But I do know that depending on who you ask, the approaches are different. And that's just how that is. But I do want to keep on going and just talk about how you eventually fell into this thing we call education, because I know that your brother played a role in that, because you saw some of the things that he was going through as a kid. And then, he eventually decided, oh, I want to be a teacher. After giving other teachers hell, he said he want to be a teacher. And you're seeing all this, and it's like, oh, this looks kind of cool. Because I know initially that was not part of the plan. You had other plans career-wise. So you got to talk to me about what got you to want to become an educator.
I think it wasn't part of my plan, but I think it was part of the higher powers plan. And let me tell you why. The reason and how I ended up getting into education, when I was a second year in college, I was a sophomore, I think, my brother was stabbed. He was attacked by these kids in the Bronx. They mistook him for someone else who is a close family friend who has since passed away. May he rest in peace. We love you, Jedediah, still. And I, at the time, was like, all right, I'm going to grow up. I'm going to go open my own nonprofit. I'm going to create a program for kids, because there were kids attacking another child, right? There weren't no more than 15, 16 when this happened. And I said to myself, the Bronx in general is one of the poor counties in America. I mean, in general, it depends on what part, but in general, it's one of the poor counties. And as such, the art programs and all these other extracurricular activities that are associated with you paying your taxes in the schools that your kid goes to, eventually they went away. And these, in my head, as a sophomore, I'm like, these kids, if they had something to do, maybe they wouldn't be out on the street joining gangs and doing all these affiliate activities. And my brother or the next brother or someone wouldn't have this happen to them. So originally, when I went to get my first master's degree, I was like, I'm going to open a nonprofit. And then I have always actually been in some capacity, shape, or form working with kids, either and I was in Upward Bound at one point. So I was a counselor for Upward Bound. I went through the program and then I became a counselor for them. I've kind of unofficially been mentoring kids and tutoring. So in some capacity, I've always worked around kids. And I think the aha moment for me goes back to when I was a child, and how two things I think that kind of stood out. Ms. Anderson, who was my first grade teacher, who advocated for me when I didn't have the capacity or the language skills to do so. That was one. My high school math and science and guidance counselors, well, I'll tell you about the guidance counselor in a minute, but the math and science teachers who wanted me to be like a mathematician or a statistician because I was so good in those skills. And I just remembered Mr. Gruber, how much I appreciated him helping me in understanding calculus. And I'd be home crying, like, I don't understand this formula. And I come back to class the next day and he's like, oh, you just do this. And he just had a way of making it so clear. And, anyone who's a teacher, you have someone or someones that kind of you remember. Mr. Gruber, Miss Anderson, those are the two people. But the third person was definitely my college counselor when I applied to Princeton. And she's like, oh, you're probably not going to get in. Why?
Say what?
Why? Microaggressions all around. And you've already discounted me before I've even given myself out there to see if this is a possibility for me. Right? Because my grades were good. I was a dancer. I had these extracurricular activities. I I have been and always have been a good writer. She didn't even give me an opportunity to even try. She already made up her mind that they weren't going to take me because of how I looked or whatever she subscribed for herself. And I would say it was those three and my brother being stabbed. I think it was those three things that really kind of made me think, is there another way that I can influence children in a positive way so that when they get older, they think back to Miss Sakho and maybe that'll cause them to make a different decision. They think about the care and the relationship that they have with this individual, and maybe they won't go down the wrong path. And that's kind of how it all started, actually. I think it helped that my brother was a teacher. He's alive and well, and he survived that attack, and he became a teacher. And when I eventually ended up going international, I had a going away party, and my brother was like, I feel like I've been chasing your footsteps my whole life. Like you've inspired me. And if you think about it, everything that I've done is actually a mirror of what you've done. Yeah. And I turned around to him and I said, actually, but me becoming a teacher is a mirror of you. So you've also inspired me, So I think that's how it all started, actually. Is that a teardrop, Kwame?
Yeah, a little bit. I think something got in my eye. No, yeah. But that's touching. That's very touching, just to see the love that you have for your brother and it being reciprocated to you. Yeah. That's important. It's definitely important.
Shout out to Pop, all the girl dads. He's a super girl dad. Shout out.
Also very important as well. Very important. So you eventually end up moving to Senegal for the long term. But I know prior to that, it was a lot of back and forth between the Bronx and Senegal. So what ultimately made you say, you know what, I'm going to stick around here for a bit?
So when I entered the teaching profession, I was lucky in that my very first job was actually, believe it or not, she hired me, but I had never met her. We spoke over the phone, and that's how I was hired. But it ended up being my 7th grade dance teacher, Miss Robinson, who ended up being an assistant principal years later when I was an adult and everything like that. So when I walked into the school, my very first day, everybody's talking about this awesome Miss Robinson. She's amazing, all this other stuff. And it doesn't click. Why would it be my 7th grade dance teacher? And I walked in and it's Miss Denise Robinson, my 7th grade dance teacher, who's my now assistant principal. Wow. And it really made it make sense. Like, okay, so this is where I'm supposed to be, because, it was that easy. It was that simple. The first year was really an amazing year. And then my second year, I worked in the Bronx, my second year as well, 3rd year. And then I would come back and forth, as you said, to Senegal just to visit. Summer break would come. I'd literally be on the plane the next day. And it was partially because I feel like I was like a fake Senegalese. And let me tell you why. I was a Senegalese from the Bronx. Like I didn't really live in Senegal. I didn't really know Senegal. And so part of my desire and then coming in the summer, that was vacation. It wasn't, it was vacation. I was having a good time, literally. And so I was like, well, if I'm going to identify as being Senegalese, I feel like I need to know this country. I need to know the culture more than what I've been exposed to in the Bronx. And not to take away from that. I'm so happy that my mom insisted on that. But I felt like there was something missing that I wanted to just go out and explore. And actually, the school that I currently work at, when I made that decision, was the only one that I applied to. And had they not accepted me, I'd have been fine staying in the Bronx. I mean, I was quite content in my job and I had a good relationship with my administration. I was quite happy. But as the higher power had divine timing and plans, it kind of really worked itself out in a very easy manner, Kwame. I mean, you know how they say things open up and you're like, like I'm being dramatic, but it really was that easy. And I ended up taking the leap and I moved here and I got recruited. And I've been working at that same school since then. So I was kind of selfish when I first arrived. I mean, it was partially for sure related to wanting to connect to the culture. Absolutely. That was the number one reason. The other reason I was like, okay, I was divorced at the time. I saw myself being remarried again. And I said, I really would like to get remarried to a Senegalese spouse. So my chances would be increased if I'm in the country. Let me go to the country, right?
Of course. Makes sense.
Lucky. I haven't been lucky. So but I was like, let me go to the country. So those are my two initial reasons. Those were my two initial reasons. The first one outweighing the second for sure, but it was part of it.
Okay, we got to talk about the fake Senegalese
Yeah.
part, because it's not specific to Senegal. If you're in sub-Saharan Africa or even other parts of the continent, this happened. Like, for instance, I'm here in Sierra Leone, and they have this thing called JC, like just comes, right? Because in Senegal,
Jolly
a
just
lot of
come.
the
Comes.
diaspora, a lot of the diasporans, Sierra Leoneans, come December time
Yeah.
to visit family and to do their vacation and holidays, and then after that's over, they go back. So just come. So that's like a stigma that's tied to them because they've been away for so long. So they're not viewed as being the same Sierra Leoneans as those who live here and are in the trenches and are going through their trials and tribulations every single day. So I know that in Ghana, even though it's not exactly the same as Sierra Leone, you have some of that going on too, that undercurrent as well, where even though it's more welcoming, it's definitely more Pan-African uh, with things that have gone on. There's still some folks who will get on you if, oh, yeah, we're a brony, like a brony, like you're
I've
foreign.
heard that. I've heard it.
You
I've
know,
heard it.
like I
Yeah.
dealt with that. I dealt with that when I was a kid, when I lived in Ghana, and even as
Yeah.
an adult. And it's something that it still bothers me a little bit,
Yeah.
but I understand it. I
Yeah.
understand why.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering from you, is there a similar type of culture that happens in Senegal where
Yeah.
you feel like, oh, I'm not really Senegalese, but I know I am, but other people feel like, you ain't
I've
really.
definitely, let me tell you, Kwame, I've definitely felt that way, but I feel like my brother probably feels that more than I. So we're siblings. We're nine siblings. I have two brothers that are in France at the moment.
Okay.
And my brother and I were the only ones who were born and raised in the US. The difference is I didn't give a rat's ass if you laughed at me because I spoke Wolof and it sounded funny. Like, it didn't bother me whatsoever. I would still say what I had to say. But
That's
my
right.
brother, his self-confidence was really impacted by that. And I think as a result, I think there was a little bit of a blockage for him related to the language, somewhat to the culture as well, because he, more than I think, felt like he wasn't accepted. Where I kind of felt that way, but I didn't care. I'm like, my mama is Senegalese. Like, you're not more Senegalese than me.
Mama
And my
spirit.
father, like my father is Gambian. Like, literally, we are Senegambian, literally. Right. So because they chose to leave and now live in another country, and now we have this other culture and all this other stuff. I would say the majority of the time, I don't think I was like, I'm less than. But I did feel like internally there were moments where I was like, well, but I'm still Senegalese from the Bronx, though. Like,
Mhm.
I'm not Senegalese from Senegal, and that's why I was like, I wonder if there's a difference. I wonder if I move, if there's going to be a difference, if it's that much, if it is, I mean, of course there's a difference. I mean, I'm American too, right? So the way I see the world is completely different. It's completely different than how I see it as a Senegalese. And that's okay too. But the thing I love about it the most is that I'm one of 18 million people here on Senegal. Like, there's nobody else like me, right? And that's the value that I feel that I have to add to any, institution, whatever. Like, that's my value. But yes,
Yeah.
I think that feeling probably is more present with my brother, and I understand it, I relate to it, we talk about it, than me, because I did not care. I'm gonna say all the mistakes, and you're gonna deal with it, and you understand what I'm saying though, right? Like, so, and I think it's their comfort too, because they're judging you too by how you say a word or what you dress like, or how you, when you're eating with the bowl, everybody's eating around the bowl. Are you adhering to the norms of eating around the bowl? So they're judging you as well because you're different.
Listen, that eating around the bowl culture is real. I had a Senegambian friend in college.
Mm-hmm.
I used to go
Mm-hmm.
to his house,
Mm-hmm.
and every Sunday it was Jabujet. We would tear that up every Sunday. Either that or it was Yassa. And
Yeah.
we'd be
Yeah.
all around the bowl. And the bowl's
Yeah.
like this
This
big.
big. Yeah. Yeah.
Well
And
beyond
that's
my arm length. Well beyond my arm length. And just the circumference
yeah.
of it.
Yeah.
Just massive. And you got 10 people around this bowl. And we just having a good old meal. So yeah,
And you're
that's
building
real.
community. And you're building
Yes, we
community.
are.
And that's how community is built. So I you know what, I appreciate that my mom insisted that we hold on to the aspects of our culture that was important to her. And I didn't understand that when I was in middle school. I didn't understand that when I was in elementary school. I kind of understood it a little bit in high school. But then when I got to college, it was like, it was so popular to be African. Everybody was trying to be African. I was a member of the African Student Organization, and it was rep your country all day. And I could, because my mom really made a point that we knew how to cook the food, understood what the clothes were. So by the time I got to college, I was like, oh, now I can really fit in because I can connect to other Africans on this level. So I get it.
That's yeah. And not everybody handles that the way that you did. There are people who really still deal with the trauma of not being able to speak the home language fluently, or the trauma of not living in their home country, which we know is out of our control.
Right.
Like
Right.
we can't do anything about that.
Nothing.
But I always tell people I'm still Ghanaian. My value system, the way that I think, the way that I even view just this idea of Pan-Africanism is very much Ghanaian. So for me, yeah, I might not be able to speak the language as well as you'd like me to, but I understand everything that you say.
Right.
I grew up with the same food, and I know where I'm from. I know where my parents are from. Those aren't things that are foreign to me. So I always like to lead with that. But it took a process for me to get there, to really respect and just honor the duality of my identities, being Ghanaian, but also being socialized in American culture. Like I embrace that as well. So it's just a marriage of the two.
And I want to comment on that a little bit. And I think that's what has helped me actually to be successful as a teacher. I'm not tooting my own horn. I'm pretty sure somebody out there doesn't like me. I don't really give a shit. But in general,
it's okay if you do. It is your show today.
But I'm saying in general, I feel like that's, as I said, that's the value added in terms of like how I show up as an educator. Because I think the beauty about when I first started teaching was that I taught in a community where it was largely West African. So I was able to connect to them, you know what I mean? And it was West African, and it was Dominican. And I had my friend from when I was younger who was Dominican, so I understood that culture. And it kind of all came back around again when I first became an educator. And so it allowed me to really be successful. First year education, it's hard, man. And the Bronx is not an easy place to go to if you're in your first year of teaching. But I feel like I had a great experience in my first year because of the things from my upbringing in my childhood that really helped me, to add value within my classroom and to connect with my parents. So fast forward, I end up started to teach internationally in Africa. Yes, the majority of my students, I wouldn't say the majority. I had quite a few students, I would say, that were African at that time. I think that there's been a shift in demographics since then.
Sure.
But it made it so much easier to connect. It made it so much because I can, like in international schools, most students are multilingual. Most students have more than one identity or cultural background. Most students have more than one passport. And those are the things that I also possess. And so it made it a little bit easier. There was definitely privilege attached to it, but it made it a little bit easier to navigate it and to connect with those families and find a way where we can have common understandings and common values to be able to have like a good classroom culture. So it goes back to that experience and the upbringing that my mom gave me, and my first year in a classroom where the majority of the students were of all these backgrounds that was familiar to me.
So this season, Identity Talk for Educators Live will be including ad spots for businesses, products, and events that are adding significant value to their communities. And here's the catch. You don't have to be an educator or an education-based business to be a part of this. We're looking for people who are just doing great work in the community, and we want to use our platform as a way to amplify their work. So if you are an entrepreneur or you know of an entrepreneur who is doing just that, bring them in our direction. Have them reach out to us. If they want to learn more about their ad spots and how they can get themselves promoted on this platform, they can contact myself, Kwame at identitytalkforeducators.com. I'll say it one more time. It is Kwame at identitytalkforeducators.com. Hope to hear from you, and let's keep on amplifying our work and building each other up. And I know for you, you've been at your school for a little over a decade.
A minute.
A long time.
A minute.
And you've had many different roles during that decade.
I have.
So you've been able to evolve in your craft as an educator. But I have to ask you, I have a highly accomplished Black woman talking to me right now. I got to know, as someone who has been an international educator and still is, and you're in that leadership position, I'd love for you to just talk about what that experience has been like, just being a Black woman, and more specifically, a Black woman leader in international education, because there's a difference there.
Yeah, there's a difference. I think there's been many ups and many downs. And I think when I think about the ups and the positive experiences and the accomplishments that I've had, it's because I've worked with people who see me for what I am and what I'm trying to bring. And so they value my conversations. They value the fact that I'm an advocate and just who I am. I'm someone who really tries to look at a situation, see the fairness in it, and try to sort of root for the underdog, but in a way that makes sense. You know what I mean? And they see that, and they help me to navigate that, and they give me good constructive feedback to help me grow. And when there's been downs, I feel like it's because there's individuals who have a mindset or an idea of who I am before I've even opened my mouth, or based on an experience that someone has had with me that wasn't their own, or just their own misconceptions or bias about an African. Because I think what ended up happening is I think they saw me as an African first, a Black person second, maybe an American after that. And when you think about, in general, the narrative about being African is not that positive in general from white dominant spaces in general. Maybe it's shifting because I think people are trying to come back to the continent. It's an economic powerhouse right now. There's every single sector, there is an opportunity. So in some ways that narrative is shifting, but it has a long way to go. And often in these places and spaces where you and I are not the dominant people who are making the decisions, you've already decided as an African and as a woman, this is who this person is. And so if we give them this, if we advance them, if we do this, if we do that, it won't be to the benefit of the institution. And it's like, really? After all of the ways in which I've showed up and I've shown out, right? Because I have not been stagnant. I started out as a homeroom teacher, and now I'm in a leadership role. That shows you, and the leadership role that I've been, I would say for the most part, the department has been successful. So that shows you that the capacity, the credentials are there. We don't have to speak on the credentials. I got 2 masters. We don't have to speak on it. But the capacity and the skill sets and all that stuff is also there.
Yes.
And it's frustrating because, you know what, Kwame, I'm tired of trying to convince somebody. Like, I'm tired. If my work is not convincing enough, then what's the point? And the thing about it is, I think at like 3 years ago, I was so exhausted. I was actually going to leave the teaching profession, and I haven't really said that out loud. But I was just so exhausted. I was like, there's got to be another sector, or maybe it's the international education system. I don't know. But there's got to be another sector where it cannot be this exhausting to have to prove yourself, even though you've already proven yourself.
Hello.
But I don't think that sector exists. And so,
I don't think so either.
the thing about it is, if you found it, let me know too. The thing about it is, I really enjoy what I do. I really enjoy working with students with disabilities and working in particular to make sure that they understand how to advocate for themselves, that the parents of those children understand what they need to be asking for, and that if at all possible, that they're in schools that value inclusion and equity for that population of students. For me, they're vulnerable. And I'm not a savior here, huh? Like, I'm not a savior at all. But I link it back to my experience as a multilingual student or a non-English speaking student when I was younger, and how no one was available to advocate for me. And I mean, I was retained. I'm now an adult. I'm a successful adult. I'm an accomplished adult. And so at the end of the day, it didn't leave this stain on my skin, but the scar internally is still there, right? You can't see it, but it's there. It's probably how come I became a teacher, if I really deeply dig down into it. And it's probably how I ended up in this particular part of teaching, right? As opposed to being humanities or something else. So it's exhausting. That's, you know, that there's nothing new about that.
Very exhausting.
But I think what keeps me going is I really like what I do. And I feel like I have put and have been a part of creating systems where I work. And that's what keeps me going. Like, looking at a problem, or it's like almost being like a detective. How can we create something that in 10, 15 years, if none of us are here, this continues and people still feel that it was a positive impact on their lives? Because if you're not doing that, then why are you here? Like,
Yeah, very, very good point. And I want to focus on just neurodivergence for a second, because it's something that's still growing in our international school ecosystem.
yeah.
Of course, if we're back in the States, we have students with IEPs, we have students with 504 plans. It's very common to go to a school and have a special education staff or department, or a learning support department.
It's the law.
It's commonplace, right?
Yeah.
Now, when you go into international schools, depending on what country you're in, depending on the staffing and the resources, you may go to a school where you don't have a learning support department. You may not have a certified special education teacher on staff, but you have students who are coming in who have different needs, whether they're neurodivergent or whether they are English learners. They need that support. So I'm wondering, in your case, and thinking about the work you do with Senia too, have you seen a major shift as far as international schools being more intentional about servicing neurodivergent students?
I think it depends on who is on the board,
Okay.
who is the head of school, and what the laws or what the culture is within the country. And I say it depends on those three things, because I think at the end of the day, if the board, I think for us, I'm going to use my school, for example, at some point, the head of school said, we need to really consider how to serve students with different needs and how to do that well. Because, you can say that and then you just put something together and it's just like unintentional crap, all this other stuff, because you're just trying to take people money. But you can really take some time and think about how can we do that well. And I think it was Alan Knobloch, who was our former director. If I say that, I know you're going to know where my school is. But he was the one that was like, we need to sort of think about that. And I think for him, he was a special education teacher prior to stepping into all these different leadership roles. And I think on some point, I think his own children, if I'm not mistaken, could be considered as students who learn differently. So there was a personal connection to it, which made it even more maybe in for him and maybe for our school more valuable because for him he has been in that role, so he could tell what a program should look like, how it should feel, what the parents experience should be. And in the country we live in, there isn't really explicit laws about how to support students with learning needs. In most of our countries, that doesn't really exist. Like in the US, it's in the law, it says it, you got to have that, and it took a long time for that to be like that in the US. And
Yes.
so I think what helped was that the board was then on board with that. Okay, that makes sense. Let's do some research. Let's talk to the people within your community who have the experience, and let's see how we can create a program like that. And here we are. And I think if you don't have those things those have to be aligned. The board has to say, okay, the director can come forth and say, I want to create this program, and the board can be like, absolutely not. I have a friend who's working in another international school where there's a student at the school that's about to transition into another division, and they don't have the supports and the capacity to support that student. They just don't. And the parents are not trying to hear it. For them, they need to be attending that school. There's no other options. Even though there are other options in the community that could probably be better for the child, they don't want to hear it. Their thing is the kid has to graduate from this particular school. And so that's a little bit hairy too, because you also have to understand your population of parents that you're dealing with.
Yes.
On both sides. Are they ready to have students who are learning differently, no matter how that shows up? It could be very clear in terms of someone who has a disability, or it could be something that is totally invincible, but the teacher knows how to support. Are they ready for those students? Or is it a population of parents who are like, no, we want to be a little bit more homogeneous. We're not ready right now. Has the needle moved forward a little bit? If you talk to Laurie Ball, who's the president and who leads SENIA,
Yep.
her entire international education career, her son couldn't go to school because he is a student with a disability. If you talk to Kathleen Nagel, International School of Health, her son's graduating and he's a student with disability.
And
she
was in Finland too.
Yeah. So it could be a yes, it could be a no. It depends on who you talk to. It depends on where you are in your, like where you physically are in the world. It depends on what's happening in your board. I think there is an understanding though, Kwame. I think there's an understanding that we can't keep doing what we were doing before. I mean, the SENIA conference that I presented at in Vietnam, that was the largest conference that we've had. It was about 450 people from all over the world.
Wow.
And SENIA has been around for 20 years. So that, so that's, for me, that's a telling, very sort of big, hey, we're here. We want to know the information. We want to know how to support students. We want to be involved. We want to help design the programs, the schools, whatever it is that we need to do, because we want to make sure that these students' needs are being.
And I think the biggest thing too is for families who have parents in the foreign service, like my family, right? That impacts their career.
Absolutely.
Because if they go to a post, chances are you're going to go to the international school, the American international school that's there, or the most prestigious one. And if that school doesn't have a learning support department, or they don't have the services or resources or facilities to serve your child and their needs, now you're in a bind, because you have to figure out, well, how do I go about doing that? If they don't have it here, do I then create a learning hub at my house? Do I get a tutor, which then becomes costly? It just creates a whole lot of other issues. And I'm thinking about a post that I saw on LinkedIn from John Springer. And John, if you listen, I gotta have you on the podcast, because we do need to talk about. Yeah, shout out to John, because he does a lot of work around neurodivergent students or students who just have different needs. And he had a post where he was talking about how he and his wife were looking at 3 different choices of schools.
We had a really good conversation about that. A really good one.
Right.
Yeah.
And he also mentioned the fact that his wife had to sacrifice her own career to ensure that their children would have the services that they need, because the schools weren't really providing that, the ones that they've been to in the past. So
Right.
there are many parents who are in that situation. And when you look at the DIJ conversation and you think about the different intersections involved in that,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much we talk about neurodivergence within that context.
We don't.
So it's not
We
it's not a
we don't.
prominent part of that conversation at all.
Yeah,
And that
no, we
has to
don't.
change.
I think when we talk about DIJ, especially just where the state of affairs are with the world, I think we mostly focus it on race, gender, LGBTQ right. I'm going to generalize, but that's primarily the conversations that I'm hearing. We often don't consider, or maybe there are some people who are trying to push that needle as well, how students with disabilities or neurodivergent students or even adults are also part of that conversation too. And I think for me that's my angle. Like that's my thing, right? Like I'm definitely a DIJ advocate. I'm an inclusion advocate. I'm a, all of the synonyms you want to describe me as. But I'm looking at it more from the passion of the work that I do as a professional and how I can sort of marry that into my personal, which is my consulting firm. Like I'm looking at what are the systems that you're creating when you say you're about equity and inclusion, but yet you are not considering these population of students or adults who learn differently and think differently. What are you really saying about your school? Like, are you only looking at gender? Are you only looking at race? Let's also look at these other factors too, because there are populations of students that the majority of the students that are out there are not diagnosed. But regardless of having a diagnosis, as an educator, you should be teaching to everybody in your space. And so what does that actually look like? If you're a school that says you're on the forefront of DIJ, okay, that's great. But what does it look like for your students who learn differently? Do they feel that? If you were to talk to them, would they agree with some of the things that you say that you value? Do they see it in how you show up for them? Those are the questions that I think sometimes we're not asking, and I think it has to be asked. And I'm not saying that I don't know that we can save everybody, right? Like I feel like when we have these conversations, you got to there's so many intersectionalities that you have to consider. There are so many. We could be here all day. But I think there are some that have to be included no matter what. And you sort of have to make that decision and call for your student body, your parent population again, and your board.
And I think to add to what you're saying, this is what contributes to a lot of the ableist ways that we even go about teacher recruitment, the ableist ways that we even go about student enrollment in different international schools. Because if we're not able to provide a service, we put in certain criteria that pretty much disqualifies those students from even being enrolled in those schools. So there are
Absolutely.
even systematic ways in which this even goes down. But that's another conversation for another day.
You
Because
need to get
there's so
John up
much
here
there.
and talk to him about some of that stuff. Because even I've even been in a situation or two where parents who are looking, the post is up. It's time for them to start looking for a posting with the federal government or one of those agencies somewhere else. And they're trying to figure out how they can not disclose because the same as what you said, like it is tied to their career. And how do they make sure that their kid gets what they need, but also at the same time, how do they make sure that their career isn't impacted in a way that's detrimental to the family?
Correct.
Right? It's a hard position to be in, and international schools don't have to play by the same rules as the US. Like it's not there's no law within international schools and that say that you have to provide these services. There's no law. I mean, it depends on so many factors, the country, the population, it depends on so many things. What I've often seen happen is that international schools, because they don't have a choice, they've accepted a student and now they have to design a program. You're in the ship and you're building the ship as the ship is moving in the water, right? And maybe that's what has to happen, right? Because maybe you didn't have to think about it because you didn't have a population of students that needed those services. But now you do. So now you kind of have to think about it and you have to plan for it and then you have to create the programs for those students. So I really don't know what the best approach is. I mean, you can, it's like you can build it and they can come, right?
Hmm.
Or you can accept it, you can accept students and then you have to build it. So for me, I
But then,
don't really care. My thing is like, as long as the needle is moving, let's move that needle.
right. And then I'm also wondering, how do we ensure that international schools are accountable for ensuring that there are services available for students who have different needs? Is it a case where we go to our accreditation agencies and there are certain guidelines in place when they're doing their audits? I don't know, but
Yeah.
it's something that requires a deeper conversation for sure.
I will add really briefly to that because I am also an accreditor for CIS and a MSA as well. I just recently went on a visit where I was the co-chair for MSA. And one, yes, absolutely. And I'm leading one of the domains for my current school as we go through the reaccreditation process. But yes, those are the standards that we're looking at. Like we're asking those questions on the standard. It says, what does well-being look like? Does it look
Mm,
like equity and inclusion for everybody, including your learning support students? What does your program actually look like? And when you go into the classroom, when you go on the visiting team, I hope people sign up for that, especially brown and black folks, so you can see what the process of being accredited. I think is important. But when you go onto those visits and you go into the classrooms and you see on paper that they say XYZ is their learning support program, and then you go and you actually see it, you can kind of decide, does the evidence of what they say they do versus what they actually do and the standard doesn't match up.
mm.
And I think the accreditators and the accreditation agency in that way can hold them a little bit accountable. I don't know how much making some of those major recommendations before you get reaccredited that has to do with learning support or student support services, it causes the school to kind of pause for a little bit, right? Because who wants to be given a major recommendation that this is what you have to do in order for you to be reaccredited? But maybe that's what has to happen. I don't know, but I think it's valuable. It's valuable.
I agree definitely with that. I see that we're at the hour, so I want
Alrighty.
to close out with this. I know it goes by so fast, it really does, but it's been great. Let's close out with this.
Mm.
How does Maymouna stay true to the teacher in her?
You know what, Kwame? I'm a person that loves learning. I'm a geek at heart. Like just no wonder I had those Coke bottle glasses. I really like to learn. I really like to explore new ideas. I like receiving feedback. And the way I stay true to the teacher in me is I don't limit myself in terms of what I can take in terms of learning. Like, let me give you an example. The reason why I have a podcast was because I was in a classroom a couple of years ago and the fifth grade students were exploring creating podcasts to talk about a topic within the UN of inquiry. And I'm like, oh, this sounds cool. So I go on and I explore it. And I'm like, oh, I think I can create a podcast around this because I actually have some interest in telling different kinds of stories. And that's how my podcast came along. And I don't feel like I'm a teacher who doesn't feel as if I'm the only one who can teach. I feel like my students are very much in a position to teach me things, just like that podcast example. I'm also a mom of a almost 6-year-old, and I'm a single mom by choice as she's adopted. And even with that, I feel like every day this little 6-year-old who sees the world from her small little eyes, and she's so intelligent and is multilingual, she's teaching me things every day. So I stay
Yeah.
true to myself by being open to learning from different sources and different avenues and recognizing that everybody has value to add and I can learn something if I'm just open to it. And so I'm at peace because I have an open mind. Like in general, I have an open mind.
And an open mind is important, especially when you're listening to different viewpoints and
Mm-hmm.
different approaches to how we need to solve some of these issues that we're dealing with within our international schools. Maymouna, thank you for coming on. I've enjoyed the conversation, and I'm assuming that you enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, it was good.
And I want to make sure that I give you an opportunity to just talk about Sakho Learning Consultancy, because you
Sure.
do consult with different international
Do.
schools agencies. So go ahead and put that plug in. Let people know how they can connect with you with that.
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn, and we'll put that on there. But Maymouna Sakho on LinkedIn. You can also find me on the gram, Sakho Learning Consultancy, and you can also find me on LinkedIn with the same handle for Sakho Learning Consultancy. When you go onto LinkedIn, you'll find a menu of the services that I provide, which include equity and inclusion workshops, trainings for your staff, for leadership, coaching, and mentoring. It also includes auditing your learning support programs, helping you build your learning support program, looking at data as a driver to setting your vision of what your programs should look like and what your department should look like. And you have some testimonials in there too, so check that out too. And we can talk offline about rates. Girls got to feed her family, so we can talk offline about rates.
Yes.
And I'm just really passionate about, helping organizations and individuals to make this world a better place from a focus of equity and inclusion. So whatever that means for you, because it looks different depending on the context.
And that's real talk. So, for those who are watching on YouTube, I'm going to quickly walk you through how you can learn about her services. So, this is Maymouna's LinkedIn profile. See your name right there. I'll even zoom in. Contact info, website, and you get to this one pager where you can learn more about her bio. Her services are right here. So here's a services tab, and it's a whole slideshow of who she is, services she provides, all that good stuff. So please make sure y'all support my sister here. She's doing some phenomenal work. And this is how our schools get better, by investing in people who have the firsthand experience on what the issues are, and they have the credibility as well to back it up, all the receipts. So let's make sure we support. And I'm going to end it with that. Thank you
Thank you.
so much for coming on.
Thank
And
you.
if we're able to, I know we're going to see each other very soon in Ghana.
Oh, yeah.
But if not, I'm wishing you your family well, and let's see if we could try to do this again in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kwame. I appreciate you. I appreciate your platform as well, in being able to bring on people whose stories you would probably never hear. So thank you for taking that leap of faith too. It's hard to be the only one out there. So thank you for doing that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, good people. We're about to end another episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live. And as always, I wish you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace out, y'all.